Hey you! Yes, you, watching this video. Do you want to own a piece of Scribbler? Only not a lock of hair or blood or flesh or anything else that will get you in trouble with the law? Well, now you can, with t-shirts, hoodies, tote bags and mugs featuring Obab Scribbler at her Teespring store. You know you want to. I shall now stop talking in third person and send you on to the video. Be lovely to each other and enjoy the show! Cupcake had been crying. It was not the disposable weeping of an unruly filly, but a far more guttural thing. The sobs built up in racking waves, thickly caked makeup on the young mare's face, smearing and dribbling down her face as she failed to hold back the tears. And when she thought she could cry no more, as she gasped for breath with raggedy bursts, the tears came again. She had sunk against one of the kitchen counters in Sugar Cube Corner, constantly rubbing the warm tears from her cheeks, aware of the mess it was making. From her blurred, watery vision, she could see the sky outside was black, could hear the tick-tocking of the old family clock as it counted down the minutes. The dance would be starting soon. That was the one thought, the only thought, that whirled around and around in her head that night. The Ponyville High graduation party. The start of her life as an adult pony, where she was supposed to put her silly fillyhood dreams behind her and look forward with bright, gleaming eyes to the life that awaited. The letter she had received earlier that day put paid to any thoughts of that. She didn't have a date for the dance. Before, it hadn't seemed like too much of an issue. She had never been a popular pony. The others would laugh at her for being short, squat and dumpy, but she had always been assured that it would all work out. Now she knew it never would, because of that terrible, crumpled letter that sat on the worktop beside her. Every pony had found someone to take them to the dance, even that strange pony who was obsessed with fans. Given the odd number of students in the school, it was inevitable that there would be some pony without a date, but she had never imagined it would be her at the bottom of the pile. Even then, she had resolved to go and have a good time, until she read that letter, and the enormity of what it said sunk in. How could any pony who ever wanted a normal life ever love her? Her parents had left the house earlier. They had kissed her and wished her luck, and told her that she looked like such a beautiful little angel in her specially made dress. Now she lay on the floor, her face smudged, her dress crumpled, weeping for the life she knew she'd never have. She could feel the hot tears pricking treacherously on her cheeks again, and sniffled piteously in a vain attempt at holding them back.
I wish,
she half choked out, as she stared at the stars in the night sky through the window.
I wish I didn't have to be so alone. Oh, Celestia, I'd give anything.
Anything?
Cupcake stopped crying with a start, scrambling to her hooves and looking around in a panic as a low, grating voice cut through her self-pity. Her heart fluttered in terror as she realized she wasn't alone in the house. Leaning against the kitchen door was an unfamiliar black pony, his eyes as red as coals, as he grinned at her with a crooked smile.
Get out!
She squeaked as she backed up against the worktop, her hooves searching for a sharp implement with which to defend herself. Finally, she grasped something that felt like a handle, and with a cry of,
I'm armed and not afraid to use it!
She whipped the object menacingly in front of her, only to discover that it was a half-eaten cucumber. The stranger just continued to smile, loping awkwardly towards her, as if uncertain how legs were supposed to work. His front legs dragged across the ground as he walked, then quickly scampered forward with a mind of their own.
I was just passing,
he said, in a low tone which would have been soothing had it not sounded so rough.
I can't stand the sound of a young, pretty filly crying. and the lock on your front door was broken, so I thought I'd investigate.
He threw down a torn and twisted lump of metal which may have once been a door lock, but was now so broken and scratched it looked as if 100 angry chickens had clawed at it. Cupcake screwed her eyes shut momentarily to stop another onset of tears.
I'm not pretty.
She croaked out in defiance.
I'm a horrible, ugly, fat pony who'll never be loved. Ever. I'll never find my special some pony.
I see.
There was an odd kindness in the stranger's voice, though his face remained an inscrutable mask. He slowly shambled towards Cupcake, though it was such a slow and odd walk that Cupcake momentarily forgot to feel threatened.
So, you would give anything to be loved, Cupcake? What would you give, I wonder?
He was very close now, so close that she could hear his rasping breath, which seemed to come from deep within his body.
I don't... How do you know my name?
Her eyes flashed into roundels as she suddenly realized how vulnerable she was.
If you touch me, I'll...
No.
There was another attempt of a smile on the stranger's face, though it was more of a rictus grin than anything with life and warmth behind it.
You wished to be helped, did you not, Cupcake? Well, here I am.
At this point, he paused for a moment to crick his neck, his head lolling a bit too much for comfort, his coat bunching and rippling like stretched fabric rather than skin.
I like to help ponies, Cupcake. Of course, there's always a cost, but I promise you'll be delighted at the results.
Cost?
All thoughts of crying had now left Cupcake's mind, as she felt her tears drying on her cheeks.
How much?
The stranger waved a hoof. It didn't bend in the right place, and flopped about a bit too much, like an oversized glove.
We can deal with that later, Cupcake. Now, your problem, as I see it...
He started to hobble around the kitchen, peering with interest at the pots and pans stacked haphazardly on the worktops.
You're alone, Cupcake. You're growing up and you've realized you've been left behind by the world. No pony understands you. No pony can understand you. There will never be any pony out there who could possibly love you. Am I right?
Cupcake gulped hard.
Maybe?
It all sounded so pathetic and self-centered when she heard it out loud, but there was something the stranger hadn't mentioned, something he couldn't know.
If it doesn't exist, then you must build it.
The stranger stopped his investigation of the kitchen and twisted around to look Cupcake directly in the eyes.
A perfect pony just for you. He'll love you forever. He'll care for you. He'll always be by your side. He'll never disappoint you or hurt you. You can have the life you've always dreamed of. It doesn't have to be like this.
That's ridiculous.
Cupcake whispered with a sniffle.
You can't make a pony. Not even with magic. I'm not a little filly anymore. I know how these things work.
Not with pony magic.
The stranger's eyes sparkled like a flickering flame, and he reached a hoof behind his back to pull out a battered book. Cupcake blinked. There didn't seem to be any pockets. It was almost as if the pony had pulled the book from beneath his very coat.
But there's magic older than pony magic. From beyond Equestria, from the wild shadowlands that lay under the world. You don't have to be alone anymore, Cupcake. You can make yourself a perfect life.
He opened the book, placing it invitingly on the kitchen table.
What do you say? Shall we bake a cake?
Cupcake looked at the strange pony and thought about his strange offer. She had never heard anything so absurd before, but in the pits of her despair, there was something alluring about the offer, and even if it was nonsense, she had nothing to lose.
Yes,
she said simply. The kitchen that night was aglow with life and energy, and for the first time in months, Cupcake broke into a smile. Her mysterious visitor, or Krastos as he had later identified himself, had transformed the room into a whirring hive of activity within moments. The oven tops were covered in pots that were boiling over with sweet candy, and every inch of worktop was coated in a fine mist of flour as the two mixed cake batter and rolled marzipan. Cupcake had never been interested in cooking. It had always been something boring that her parents seemed to obsess over. But watching Krastos dart from cupboard to cupboard, enthusiastically pulling out various ingredients with a song and dance, explaining in great detail the differences between the types of sugar, the techniques of sifting flour, and how to get the exact amount of air into the batter, it all suddenly made so much sense. At first, he'd been content to have Cupcake assist, leafing through the pages of the recipe book and calling out quantities and techniques. Later, though, as the cooking became more intense and the air became clogged with flour, he made her take the lead. It was, he said, vital for the magic to work that the cake be made with love. Finally, the ovens had disgorged their delicious cargo, and the two piled layer upon layer of cake on the table, until every inch of it was lost underneath a heap of sponge.
And now,
Krastos had said with a smile, wiping an icing-covered hoof over his forehead,
you make your perfect stallion.
Cupcake wasn't an artist. In her mind, she had the picture of the most hunky stallion imaginable, but like her failures in sculpting class, it didn't seem to want to materialize in solid form. The cylinders of cake she cut for the legs were too thin, and as she built them up with icing, she realized she had made them too long. The body was not firm and muscular, but a stubby tube, and instead of a rugged, handsome face, the best she could manage was a crude rectangle balanced atop a long, thin neck. It looked ridiculous. Her bottom lip quivered again, as she looked over the unsophisticated cake statue that stood in front of her. Krastos seemed to beam with excitement, though, looking over it, carefully dusting icing over any cracks.
It's good,
he exclaimed, his red eyes shining bright.
I see a lot of skill here, Cupcake. You should be proud. You are going to be so happy together. I know it.
Together they put the finishing touches on the cake, covering it with a sweet butterscotch coating, threading in a candy tail, even going as far as to rolling individual strands of marzipan for the mane. Cupcake took a step back and looked carefully at the pony they had made together, which now stood in the middle of the kitchen like some macabre cake statue. It didn't look much like a normal pony, but the strange, goofy creation had an almost endearing quality to it.
Is that it?
She looked at Krastos expectantly as he brushed a string of marzipan off his hooves.
Now do you make it real?
No.
Krastos trotted across to the table, slowly rolling out a parchment which, like the book, had seemingly come from nowhere.
Now, with the prize in view, now we discuss payment, Cupcake.
Cupcake looked closer at the gawky cake pony they had made. It didn't seem possible that it could be brought to life in any way, but there was something about it, something she couldn't put her hoof on, that made her want to hug it and never let go.
Payment?
Her face fell as she moved over to the scroll.
I don't have much money, but maybe a loan?
She looked at him brightly, her chubby face breaking into a hopeful grin. Krastos seemed to find this amusing as he let out a low laugh.
I have no interest in money, little pony.
He smiled in that lopsided manner of his.
I seek more interesting acquisitions. You must realize this, Cupcake. The magic that I will use to bring him to life is old magic, and it comes with old rules.
He looked across at Cupcake, pointing out various sentences on the scroll.
For all intents and purpose, he will have the outward appearance of a real pony. He will think he is real, he will act as if he is real, and he can do everything
He gave a wink at this point.
that a real pony can do. But he must never realize he is a cake. The magic will take 20 years to properly cool. The binding ingredient is self-belief. If he should ever realize that he isn't real, he will instantly crumble back into lifeless cake forever.
Cupcake nodded mutely, frowning at the scroll.
So I have to make sure he doesn't realize he's a cake for 20 years? Is that it?
Krastos shook his head, and his friendly smile sneered slightly.
Oh no, that is where I come in. This is the deal, Cupcake. You can have your perfect stallion. You can have your perfect life. You can even have your perfect family. But if within those 20 years, if he ever discovers he isn't real and turns back into cake...
Somehow, within the bright room, his expression fell into shadows.
I get your children.
The kitchen fell into silence as Cupcake processed the bizarre bargain.
And that's it?
She finally replied, a note of trepidation creeping into her voice.
That's it.
Krastos swept a hoof over the contract.
It's convoluted, yes. But old magic has old rules which must be abided by. It's a pain, but if you want a pony, that's what you need to do. Otherwise, certain parties might get involved.
He cleared his gravelly throat as if about to launch into a long speech.
Now, you may be wondering why I want...
Yes!
To the surprise of her visitor, Cupcake pushed herself in front of the contract and slammed her hoof down at the bottom, leaving a hoof-shaped smear of icing above her name, which had been carefully prepared in advance. Krastos seemed taken aback as he started to stammer slightly, but soon regained his composure.
I had a whole speech planned out. It was going to be very convincing.
It was. You get my children if he turns back into a cake. It's a tough business, but then so's life.
Cupcake chirped this almost too lightly and scooted expectantly over to the cake pony, her tail flapping from side to side in anticipation.
Now, are you going to make him alive?
I see.
Krastos rolled up the contract and tucked it back inside his coat somehow as he moved to the cake. He leaned upwards to the head, but paused, turning back to Cupcake, who felt as if his blazing eyes were staring deep into her soul.
Do not try to trick me, Cupcake. I'll find out. That would be very unwise. Very unwise indeed.
With that, he reached his mouth to the ear of the cake pony and whispered something that Cupcake strained to hear. Then he stepped back with a flourish.
It is done. It will be a few moments before the magic takes effect. So before he wakes, I will bid you farewell.
He turned to leave, sloping towards the doorframe, but before he passed out of view, he gave one final dark smile.
And I'll be back. I will be back, Cupcake. No matter what you think. I'll have your family. You will fail, and then everything you hold dear will be mine.
Cupcake ignored all hint of menace in the pony's voice. Instead, she was fixated on the cake pony, which seemed to shift and blur with every passing second. The icing shimmered, becoming a fine fur coat. The crude, oblong head softened as the candy features became real. The candy tail slowly began to sway from side to side. Then, he blinked. In front of Cupcake stood a tall, lanky pony with wide, googly eyes, who looked about in confusion.
"Hello,"
he exclaimed in surprise.
"I'm Mr. Cake. You're the most beautiful pony I've ever seen. Will you go to the dance with me?"
Cupcake's astonishment at the magic actually working was replaced with a smile of absolute joy. She leapt upon her creation, wrapping her forehooves around his thin, scraggly neck.
Yes!
She sobbed, her tears this time ones of happiness, as she buried her face in his sweet-smelling mane.
Yes, yes, yes!
Everything would be better now. She had a stallion who would love her unconditionally, and without any strings attached. Her heart burst with a strange sort of pride as she thought about how she had turned tragedy into her advantage, how Krastos' contract was meaningless. For on the worktop, still in that crumpled envelope, was the awful letter from the Ponyville hospital, telling her that she would never be able to bear foals. And that was how Mrs. Cake thought that she had tricked the devil. Pinkie sniffled as Mrs. Cake finished her story, the room descending into a strange quiet.
I'm so sorry, Miss Cake. I didn't realize. Why has he come back then? Do you think he's gone now?
Let me in, little ponies. Oh, I will huff and I will puff and I'll...
Pinkie Pie and Mrs. Cake screamed together, clutching each other as the heavily barred kitchen door splintered, the head of a huge iron axe crashing through the fragments of wood. With a rough tug, the axe head withdrew, only to be replaced by a burning red eye that peered into the house.
I can see you, Cupcake.
Came the creature's rasping voice as a scaly claw snaked through the hole and reached towards the lock.
Go away! Go away!
Mrs. Cake snatched up a rolling pin and raced towards the door, battering the hand away again and again. It withdrew with a hiss of pain.
There's nothing for you here, Krastos! Leave me alone! Ah!
She leapt back with a screech as the axe impacted again on the door, causing the mighty wooden entrance to buckle hard. With a furious scrabbling of limbs, Krastos reached inside and pulled back the bolts, letting the broken door swing open.
No one is coming to save you,
he croaked as his blazing eyes swept across the two terrified mares, who once again clung to each other for comfort. He was in some ways like a tree, a tall black cylinder that tapered toward the top. But instead of leaves, his entire body seemed to be made up of long strands of thick fur, which swayed as he moved on imperceptible feet. One scraggly claw held a wicked axe, which glinted in the moonlight as he stalked into the house.
My magic has erected a barrier around your happy little home. Any pony who passes will see your home as it was. Perfectly quiet, perfectly untouched. And of course, they will not hear any screams.
He raised his axe menacingly.
But the princesses...
Shush!
Pinkie stammered, but the creature shushed her, reaching into his deep matted hair to unfurl a scroll, stained with age-old icing, a familiar hoofprint stamped at the bottom.
They will not interfere,
Krastos croaked, shuffling forwards, holding the scroll out to demonstrate his point.
In the past, Celestia stopped me from stealing ponies, but a contract. A contract drawn up with old magic and signed willingly. Even she cannot stop that.
But what do you want?
Mrs. Cake was hugging Pinkie again, her earlier bravado in beating off the attacker long fled. Pinkie could feel the older mare shaking as the odious creature scuttled nearer, her heart racing in her chest as those soulless red eyes blazed down with a look of utter malevolence.
I never had any children. I can't. I tricked you.
Her voice turned to a pale whisper.
Have you come for me?
No, Cupcake.
There was a smug tinge in Krastos's reply as the creature stopped in front of the pair, his axe shifting in his clawed grip. Pinkie could almost see a flicker of amusement in those terrible eyes.
I am an old creature, and a patient one. I have watched you from the shadows, watched your happy, perfect life.
He started to spit out the words.
I have seen you laugh and play and sing, and now I have returned to take it all from you and revel in your misery. Your life was a fragile illusion, one of make-believe. You pretended to have a husband, and in a different way you pretended to have a daughter.
A claw reached out from the black mound of scraggly fur to stroke Pinkie Pie's cheek. She recoiled in disgust.
No, Cupcake. I am not here for you. I am here for Pinkie Pie.
Pinkie pressed her ear against the kitchen floor, straining to hear what was being said. Mrs. Cake had convinced Krastos to discuss terms with her in the front room on the pretense that she didn't want Pinkie to see her beg. The vile creature had seemed amused at this, and agreed. And so, for the next 10 minutes, Pinkie had been listening through the door to Mrs. Cake plead for mercy, offer up Sugar Cube Corner, anything to make the monster happy. But he just laughed. Pinkie knew the real reason Mrs. Cake had wanted Krastos alone. She was supposed to run away. The broken outer door looked inviting as it hung open on its hinges, the clean night air of Ponyville lying beyond. It was so tempting to race outside and hide or get help. Had Krastos been telling the truth? Was there really nothing the princess could do to stop him? She had squinted hard out of the door, and true to Krastos's word, there was a faint shimmer around Sugar Cube Corner, as if a semi-transparent wall had been erected. Would she be able to pass through it, or would Krastos instantly realize she had gone? And what would he do to Mrs. Cake if he found she had escaped? Mrs. Cake's beseeching wails from the other room got louder, and Pinkie felt her heart sink. She sloped over to the remains of Mr. Cake, looking down at them sadly and gripping the fallen head in both hooves, placed it back on the neck. It seemed like the right thing to do.
I'm sorry, Mr. Cake.
Pinkie stood before the strange-looking cake, hugging herself as she looked at the pile of sponge and icing, which had once been so alive.
You're one of the most wonderful ponies I know. You're kind and thoughtful and generous and...
She stumbled over her words as she confessed before the inanimate object.
And you're like a second father to me. This is all my fault. I never realized it didn't matter if you were a cake. You're still Mr. Cake. And if you thought you were real, then you were real. And that's all that matters.
She leaned forwards and gently kissed the cake on its spongy muzzle.
Goodbye, Mr. Cake. This is all Pinkie's fault, so Pinkie will put it right.
A tempting offer, but no. I think I'll stick with the original bargain.
Krastos rasped as he stood in the middle of Mrs. Cake's sitting room, the tall black furry monster gripping an axe, a macabre contrast with the pleasant soft furnishings that littered the room.
But what about...
Mrs. Cake gulped hard as she racked her mind for more things to offer the creature, more ways to distract him while Pinkie could escape.
What about me? I signed the contract, not Pinkie. It's me you want.
Krastos plucked the contract from his furry body and unfurled it, scanning his flaming eyes over the lines.
It doesn't work like that, Cupcake. She accepted the invitation in your life, she becomes my property. And now...
His clawed digits gripped the axe shaft tighter.
I grow tired of this.
Yes! When are we going?
Both Krastos and Mrs. Cake turned to see Pinkie marching into the room, clutching a small, hastily packed suitcase in her mouth, which she carefully placed on the floor before standing beside Mrs. Cake.
Oh, Pinkie, no!
Mrs. Cake's face crumpled, and she seemed to sag slightly, as if a great weight had been placed on her back.
I can't lose you too, Pinkie. Not because of my foolish actions.
Pinkie shook her head firmly.
No, Miss Cake. You took me into your family and loved and cared for me like I was your own. It's time I paid for the privilege.
She stamped a hoof down and looked up at the bristling mass of Krastos that loomed over her.
Why do you want me anyways?
Why, Pinkie Pie?
There was a gleam in Krastos's eyes.
I want to make glue with you, of course.
Pinkie's demeanor suddenly dropped, and she clopped her forehooves to her mouth in a shriek.
You want to boil me up into glue?
She squealed in horror. Krastos was momentarily taken aback by this.
What? No!
His gravelly voice choked out.
No, that'd be horrible. Why would you think that? I want you to make glue with me, Pinkie. Become my assistant.
He shambled over toward a window, glancing out at the night sky beyond.
I live in a twisted shadowland, Pinkie Pie. In an upside-down dark castle on the underside of the world. In that dank, miserable hellhole, I sulk with only my glue vats to keep me company. My days are spent foraging in the nightmare forest for the right plants to boil into glue. My nights are spent awake, tormented by the terrible screams and cries of the unnatural beasts which lurk outside. There is no light, no laughter, no friendship. I have lived for hundreds of years, Pinkie Pie. Hundreds of lonely, wretched years.
He swung around suddenly, shattering a framed portrait of the Cakes. Mrs. Cake jumped with a shriek.
Once, years ago, I left my dark castle and journeyed across Equestria on my glue card. I saw the perfect little lives of you perfect happy little ponies, and my heart grew more and more bitter that you had so easily what I did not. So I vowed to ruin it.
A strange, scratchy laugh grew in his throat.
I made small deals at first, perhaps a comp given to a pony whose mane I then took. A never-ending match which burned down everything it touched. A goose that laid golden eggs, which soon produced so much gold it became worthless. I became bolder and bolder. My gifts made those silly ponies so happy. And then I took everything from them and reveled in their anguish. And they all thought they could trick me, Cupcake. And they were all wrong.
Krastos turned his attention back to Pinkie Pie, slowly shuffling to the pink pony, who was rooted to the spot.
The happiness I gained from making ponies miserable did not last. I still had to return to my dank castle to tend to my glue vats. And then I thought, what if I had a pony to help in my task? to chain up and steer the stinking glue as it bubbled away, to venture into the slimy forest and gather the ingredients, to have another brought down low to my level. That would make my life so much happier. The princess stopped me from stealing ponies, so I devised a new deal. And I waited. I have waited so very long.
Pinkie's eyes twitched at this.
You put an advert in the paper!
She snapped, suddenly in a tone that sounded just a bit inappropriately loud.
That's what you do! You put out an advert for an assistant! You don't need to go kidnapping or tricking any pony with your weird convoluted plans! You just ask nicely!
A low gurgling erupted from within Krastos, and Pinkie Pie couldn't tell whether it was supposed to be laughter or anger.
No sane pony would want to work in my glue factory. Trust me, it is a filthy, foul place.
He started to slope towards Pinkie Pie, extending a clawed hand.
I do not know whether you would bring your happiness there, or it would break you. Either way, you are now mine forever.
The claw reached out to grab Pinkie by the scruff of her neck. She scrunched her eyes closed.
Get the hay away from my family!
Pinkie Pie's eyes blinked open in surprise. Beside her, Mrs. Cake had given a loud gasp. Even Krastos turned in astonishment, his flaming eyes blazing with an almost confused look.
That's impossible. It's against all known laws of magic. You're not real anymore. You're just a cake.
Standing in the open doorway, silhouetted by the moonlight that streamed in through the kitchen window, was a strange, lumpy pile of sponge in the shape of a pony. Slowly shuffling forwards, chocolate button eyes seemingly fixed in a frown.
That's Mr. Cake to you!
He launched forwards, swinging a large oven tray in his spongy hoof at Krastos' head. Despite his menacing size, the dark creature was caught by surprise as the tray impacted with a clang on the deep fur that covered his head as it hit something solid within the hairy mass. Krastos screeched in a high-pitched scratchy wail, staggering backwards and dropping his axe. Mr. Cake took the advantage, leaping atop him and bringing down the tray again and again. Pinkie picked her jaw off the floor as she watched the bizarre battle, and then, coming to a decision, turned to a similarly shocked Mrs. Cake. Grasping her suitcase in her mouth, Pinkie dashed forwards to swing it at the furry monster, who squawked in panic, almost like a bird, throwing his thin, stick-like arms in front of him in an attempt to protect himself. Mrs. Cake raced around the room, throwing everything she could find at the creature. Crockery, vases, even the picture frame that he had earlier shattered. Krastos continued to stagger about in panic, but every time he tried to push off Mr. Cake, he was attacked by another whack of Pinkie's suitcase.
No, I am Krastos the Gluemaker. You should fear me.
He didn't get to finish his sentence, as Mrs. Cake hauled up a heavy wooden table and hurled it at his head. He collapsed with a final cry onto the floor, looking for all the world as if a large rug with two stick-like arms had been thrown into the room. For that moment, everything was still. The three ponies stared at the fallen Krastos for a moment, half in shock, and then, with a cry of joy, Mrs. Cake dove into Mr. Cake's spongy arms, the biggest smile that Pinkie had ever seen on her face.
I thought you were gone forever!
She swiped a hoof over her cheeks to hold back the tears, which seemed to be starting to flow freely.
None of it was real. It was all a lie. I made you love me with magic.
She sniffled, pulling back and looking at the crude icing-covered oblong of cake that was now Mr. Cake's face.
Can you ever forgive me?
Cupcake.
Mr. Cake pulled away from his wife, taking her hooves in his, looking into her eyes with his chocolatey gaze. He glanced down towards the unconscious Krastos.
I love you. I've always loved you since the moment I saw you. No amount of magic could ever fake that. There are some things even he doesn't understand, Cupcake. I might be a cake, just a collection of sugar and margarine and flour. But it doesn't matter. I'm real where it counts. Inside.
Oh, carrot cake.
Mrs. Cake leant forwards and the two embraced in a kiss. Mr. Cake's features seemed to shimmer and melt, his coat rippling as it turned from cake and icing into fur, his mane flowing back into hair, and his eyes swimming from chocolate into bright pupils full of life. Pinkie Pie half smiled with glee, half looked away in embarrassment as the cakes kissed. It was then she noticed the body of Krastos starting to twitch, one thin limb slowly lifting itself off the floor.
He's awake!
She squeaked, leaping into the air with a start.
What do we do?
Mr. Cake broke the kiss with a look of anger on his face.
A sack! Get a sack, Pinkie! A strong one!
Pinkie understood. She raced into the kitchen toward the pantry, where empty sacks of flour were stored, and grabbed the strongest she could see. Together, the Cakes lifted that horrible creature and bundled him into the sack as he started to awaken with low croaks. His entire body seemed to be fur. There was barely anything to hold on to as they stuffed the fur into the sack, but eventually it was full, bulging with black hair, two red eyes staring out the top as the sack quivered and swelled as Krastos struggled. Mrs. Cake pulled the drawstrings of the sack tight, and Krastos wailed again, the red eyes that peeked out of the small hole at the top quivering slightly.
Mercy! Show me mercy, I beg of you!
With a sharp kick of her hoof, Mrs. Cake pulled the string even tighter.
You horrible monster! You horrible, evil, selfish monster!
She cried out, shaking slightly as Mr. Cake put a comforting hoof around her.
I can't believe I was scared of you for so long! You evil, wicked thing!
What do we do with him?
Pinkie whispered as she watched the shaking sack. It seemed like it might burst at the seams at any moment.
Let me out! Let me go! I have learned my lesson, honest.
Krastos' croaky voice echoed out from inside the sack.
I don't think so.
Mr. Cake started to haul the sack toward the kitchen, eliciting squeals of protest from within.
He's an evil monster, Pinkie. And you know what happens to evil monsters in the fairy tales.
As Mrs. Cake and Pinkie followed the procession into the kitchen, Mr. Cake grabbed a rolling pin in his mouth and battered the sack, causing Krastos to whimper piteously, the punches and kicks from within the sack quieting down. Then, Mr. Cake placed the entrance of the sack against an open oven door, tipped the contents in, and slammed it.
There!
His voice heightened slightly with a tinge of anger.
You dare to threaten my family, Krastos? You wanted to cause misery and hurt? How does it feel, Krastos?
He leaned closer to the closed oven door.
How does it feel when the horseshoe is on the other hoof? Should I bake you like a cake?
A weak scrabbling came from within the oven as claws scratched at the heavy-duty door, and a strange rasping noise started to rise at intervals. To Pinkie's ears, it was almost like crying.
Let me out! Let me out!
He choked, voice muffled by the oven door.
No, you are a truly evil monster!
Mrs. Cake rapped a hoof against the door, causing a shriek from inside.
You have brought only pain and wickedness into this world!
Mr. Cake? Miss Cake?
Pinkie looked between the two with a sad expression on her face.
I know he's hurt you both, but may I?
She gently pushed them out of the way and opened up the oven door a crack. Mrs. Cake let out a gasp and went for a rolling pin, but Krastos did not burst out. Instead, a clawed hand curled around the small opening, and two red eyes peered out. There was none of the malevolent fire in them from earlier, just the quivering look of a scared animal.
Mr. Krastos!
Pinkie began, gathering her thoughts as she looked at the monster in the oven, while keeping a tight grip on the door with her forehooves in case he tried to escape.
Am I right in thinking that you wanted a pony to help you because you hate your job? And you hate where you live? And you go around being nasty because making others feel worse than you makes you happy?
Krastos was quiet for a moment. Then his croaking voice echoed out.
Yes, my castle is the foulest, darkest place imaginable. No light penetrates.
So, if you don't like where you live, or what you do, and that's the only reason you're so mean, why don't you move?
She looked at Mr. and Mrs. Cake.
Why don't you come and live here?
What?
The Cakes chorused, staring at Pinkie Pie as if she was mad.
It's not true that he only brought pain and wickedness into the world, Miss Cake. He also helped you make Mr. Cake, and he's the nicest, most wonderful pony I know. How could anyone who could do something like that be totally evil?
She opened the oven a crack wider, peering back into its depths.
Mr. Krastos, what if you carried on doing nice things for ponies, but then skipped the bargain of evil part? Then ponies will like you and you'll have lots of friends. You wouldn't have to upset ponies to be happy, because you'd be happy anyways.
The creature in the oven seemed to ponder this.
But I am Krastos the Gluemaker. I live in the shadow in the dark upside-down castle next to the nightmare forest. I boil glue in my glue vats. I am the monster that sulks in the shadows.
Well, you obviously don't like doing that.
Pinkie gave her biggest, most heartfelt smile into the oven.
You can be whatever you want. Mr. Cake's a cake, but he can be a pony. I'm not related to the Cakes, but I can still be their daughter. Living dreams can be a limit if that's what makes her happy. Just because you're a monster doesn't mean you have to be a monster. It's a mad, crazy world, Mr. Krastos. You should be whatever makes you happy, not what you think you should be.
Krastos considered this, his red eyes blinking in the darkness.
But I make glue. Who would make the glue if I did not boil in my glue vats? Making glue is all I'm good for. I am the glue maker.
Some pony else can make the glue.
Pinkie replied calmly, as if talking to an errant filly.
Some pony who enjoys making glue. And if no pony wants to make the glue, then Equestria will have to go without. It's not worth upsetting someone's life over.
Mrs. Cake had been quiet up until this point as Pinkie talked, but then she stepped forwards to look into the oven, her expression now free of the earlier hate, feeling only pity.
You're wrong, Krastos. That night, 20 years ago, you looked so happy and alive when you were baking. I bet you can be an incredible cook if you wanted to be.
I don't have to make glue.
There was a hopeful lilt in Krastos's reply.
I don't have to live in this horrible castle.
No, you don't.
This time it was Mr. Cake's turn to speak, his own face no longer showing any anger.
You're welcome to stay here for as long as you want. You made me. So, in a way, you're my father.
He looked down at himself, then at Pinkie, and finally at Mrs. Cake.
We might not be a traditional family, but then again, who is? Dad.
Pinkie leaned over the oven door and reached a hoof into the darkness.
What do you say, Mr. Krastos? Do you want to give it a go? Do you accept our friendship?
A clawed hand slowly rose to grasp the tip of Pinkie's hoof.
Yes.
The next morning, the residents of Ponyville awoke to a worrying sight. The side door to Sugar Cube Corner had been smashed in, as if feverishly attacked with an axe. After a few fruitless knocks on the front door, some of the braver ponies decided to enter. There in the kitchen, they found a giant hairy monster wielding an axe, and he was using the axe to carefully cut slivers of candied fruit to put in cupcakes. What was further confusing was that neither of the cakes nor Pinkie Pie seemed at all concerned about this. The worries of the citizenry of Ponyville at the monster in their midst were soon allayed by the fact that the cupcakes he baked were absolutely delicious. As the days went by, the strange monster was seen about the town, and soon became less a figure of terror and more another valued resident. When he wasn't baking with the cakes, he would offer to cut the lawn of neighbors' houses, build boats for ponies to sail on the lake, even give talks about a variety of exotic subjects at the schoolhouse. Within a few weeks, Krastos had opened his own restaurant in Ponyville. It served the best salads for miles around. It was here that Pinkie Pie found herself sitting outside one day, feeling oddly alone as the ponies around her laughed and ate their food in the midday sun. Her own meal sat in front of her, a delicious array of leaves and seeds, sprinkled with a dash of beetroot sauce. It was, critics said, one of the best meals available in Equestria, a taste sensation. With a sigh, Pinkie slumped down. It wasn't making it any better.
Happy birthday, Pinkie Pie.
Pinkie turned her head at the familiar rasp beside her to see Krastos shuffling into view, an apron and chef's hat strapped to his tall, furry frame.
Don't be sad, Pinkie. It's on the house. And I have some new ice cream I want you to try. It's party flavor. Tastes of parties.
He pulled a seat up as his waiters bustled about the other table, taking a short break from his tasks.
It wasn't your birthday present, was it? I thought you'd like that.
Pinkie gave a small smile.
No, Mr. Krastos, it's not like that.
Amongst all the gifts she'd received that morning was a large box entitled Flim and Flam's Homebrew Cider Set. Apparently she could brew 40 gallons of cider in her own home. She wasn't sure where she would put 40 gallons of cider. She swirled her fork around her salad listlessly.
It's good news about the cakes,
Krastos exclaimed brightly, giving Pinkie Pie a little nudge.
Now Mrs. Cake has a bun in the oven.
He paused.
Well, cake.
He leaned in towards Pinkie Pie conspiratorially.
Well, cakes. Plural. She made a bit too much dough, so I thought, Krastos, old chap, give her a double surprise. Now they'll have 2 folds instead of 1. She'll be double as happy.
Pinkie stopped her moping to process this.
I don't think it works that way.
She began.
And I still had some mix left over, so I got a bit creative, gave one some winks and the other a horn. A bit of variety is always good.
Krastos sounded so enthused that Pinkie didn't have the heart to explain why that wasn't the greatest idea. He peered at his wrist, around which a large watch had been strapped.
A few more hours of cooking, I think. Foals are much harder than full-grown ponies, but it'll be worse in the end. Of course, they'll have to sneak them into the hospital and can't give them a bath for at least 3 days.
He trailed off as Pinkie didn't respond.
Are you feeling left out, Pinkie?
Pinkie nodded.
Now the cakes are having bowls. Where does that leave me? I thought I had 2 families, and now I don't know where I fit in either of them.
She slowly brought out a letter and placed it on the table. There was another rock inside, and the envelope bulged at the seams, the flap sticking open. It had become harder to seal letters after the glue shortage. She pushed the rock out onto the table glumly.
Is that all?
Krastos reached around with a scaly claw and gave Pinkie a little hug.
Pinkie, the cakes still love you. Of course they do. Folds don't change that. You're still a part of our lives. Haven't you learned how important self-belief is?
He reached down towards the rock with his other claw, picking it up and peering at it intently with his red eyes.
And I think your family knows you better than you realize.
Pinkie gave a start as Krastos crushed the rock in his fist, sending a small shower of pebbles down.
What?
She squeaked in surprise, but was cut off as Krastos pushed the rock shards into her open mouth. They started to fizz and crackle. Pinkie's eyes shot open with surprise at the miniature candy explosion in her mouth.
Pop rocks!
She exclaimed with a full mouth.
Pop rocks!
She laughed. Krastos laughed. Life was good.
Flecks of snow fall on your face. Keep this kiss, don't forget my name. Darkness comes to take us away. Don't forget that you loved me. Love is a magic we were born to make. Hold it tight, don't let it break. Poisoned apples, dark hearts make. Will die when you kneel and kiss me. Pages fade in the tale we knew. Don't be scared if you can't find truth. Never doubt I will always find you. Darkness falls but our hearts stay true. Don't be scared if I'm gone from view. Never doubt I will always find you. Flecks of snow fall on your face. I'm not yours in this cursed place. Darkness came and took you away, but I don't doubt that you love me. My heart aches when I'm by your side. I feel so lost, but I don't know why. Dreams of love in the snow so white, and tears of a prince who would kiss me. Pages fade